Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we look at the Queen Bee of Sydney's Underworld, Kate Leigh. Kate Leigh was born Kathleen Mary Josephine Behan and nicknamed Bonnie, which is a Scottish word meaning beautiful. She was born on the 10th of March of 1881 and was the 8th child of 13 born to Roman Catholic parents Timothy Behan and Charlotte Smith. Her father was a bootmaker or cobbler and moonlighted as a horse trainer. It never made as much money as what was required for 13 children. He had a stressful life, and as per Larry Writer's Underbelly Razor book, it states that Kate and her father were usually at odds and he smacked her around a little bit as a child. At the age of 8, she was stealing from her parents and her siblings as well as from local shops, and she also ran away from home. Now, it's stated that she was taken at the age of 12 and placed into the Parramatta Industrial School for girls. Whether this was done by a child services like mob on the parents or whether the parents voluntarily sent her away, it isn't quite clear. But it could have been because she kept running away, and it was stated that her father would withhold food from her, and then the industrial school have put it down as neglect by her parents. So there's probably a mixture of both there. Parents wanting to get rid of her because she was a bit of a willful and cheeky child, as well as docs or the child services, whatever they had at the time, wanting to take a child who was being neglected from the parents. But either way, it wasn't a great start to Kate's life. We had an episode a few months back of this awful place, which was an orphanage as well as a girls' home. It is also likely the reason that Kate leant toward a life of crime. We saw that in the Chow episodes as well, that these institutions often raised underworld figures. The good intentions often turned sour once placed into these institutions or these hell homes, where further neglect and an abundance of abuse would take place, and the children were most likely better off where they'd come from with their parents originally. The school housed Kate until she was 18. Kate worked for various factories in Glebe and Surrey Hills, as well as doing some waitressing jobs, but nothing seemed to be able to sustain the income. And she was also fined for vagrancy, meaning that she was sleeping on the streets or living off the streets. Kate fell pregnant in 1900. Having a baby girl, she named Eileen May. Kate was 21 in 1902 when she married 30-year-old carpenter, illegal bookmaker and petty crook Jack Leigh. The relationship didn't last very long when they both were sent to jail for beating up or assaulting a landlord who they had withheld rent from. They tried to get out of the jail time by stating that Jack had only beaten him up because Kate was in bed with him, but it didn't fly very well in court, and they both ended up serving 5 years jail. Once the jail term was over, the relationship soured and they parted ways. After Kate leaves Jack, she's alone with Eileen. She'd had Eileen in a convent while she was in jail, and now back out, she had to look after Eileen the best way she could, moving from factory to factory and eventually turning to the streets once again, and most likely prostitution, to make ends meet. She ends up meeting up with a man by the name of Samuel Dewey Freeman, and she ends up in a relationship with him, staying at his house with Eileen and his henchman Ernest Shiner Ryan. Dewey comes up with a plan to rob the Eveleigh Railway Workshop and steal the pay for their workers. They'd gotten away with the crime, although the insider they had at the workshop proved to be an informer for the police and dobbed on Freeman. He in turn was arrested. Shiner Ryan sent his share of the money down to Melbourne to a mate to hold on to it for him so he could get down there. But by the time he arrived down there, his mate had absconded to Tasmania. When Shiner said to a lover of his of what had happened, she, hoping to get the reward for his arrest, dobbed him into police. Now, strangely enough, at the hearing, Freeman had told police previously that he'd been at the races at the day that the crime was committed, so he couldn't have done the crime, but had forgotten that and then got Kate to lie under oath, stating that he'd been at their premises the whole day. Both of them went to jail, and unfortunately for Kate, she was charged with perjury and given 7 years for lying under oath. Kate vowed she would swing before she stuck to another man, giving a false alibi and then ending up in jail herself. She had to put poor Eileen back in the convents until she could get back out again. Poor Kate's good-natured heart would see her give more false alibis and pay bonds for many more crimes to come. Kate, now on her own again, had to make money to keep her and Eileen safe. Working at the factories just wasn't paying enough, and she turned to prostitution, as this was a way to make a lot of money and try and give Eileen a better life, which for a smart woman got her well into the underworld. And she was a real contender for top woman of the street, rising up to become a madam herself. She was also well connected and would solidify her network by giving false alibis to other underworld figures as well as bail money, this making her well liked and quite rich in the long run. She was becoming quite powerful and opened sly grog dens which really soared. Kate had made it, you would think. However, the police were always on her back, raiding her home and going through her belongings, as we've seen on the Underbelly Razor series. There was quite a bit of competition for top spot. Many tried to rise up and take business away from Kate. One competitor at this time was Matilda Devine, also in the prostitution and drug game. Like Kate, we will have an episode dedicated to Tilly very soon. But these women went toe-to-toe for top spot for decades and caused many deaths in this feud. Kate had her business in Riley Street of Surrey Hills, and for the most part was well liked in the area, often supporting her community through many donations and as well as holding little events at Christmas time and various other times throughout the year, especially aimed at kids, as her childhood was quite rough, and she tried her best to support other women who were single as well as children who were from bad backgrounds. She knew what a tough life as a child was all about, and did her best to help wherever she could. The men in Kate's life were more like thorns in her side, causing her more trouble than they were worth, probably why later on, cougar style, she had relations with the much younger men she employed. After her divorce to hubby number 1, James Leigh, she kept the surname but changed the spelling from L-E-E to Leigh. She married hubby number 2 in 1922, Edward Teddy Joseph Barry, who was a musician from Perth, but also a sly grog dealer. So it seemed like a match made in heaven, until she found him in bed with another woman and proceeded to beat he and the other woman until they were out of her house. It is said that she allowed him to stay in her house in his later life when he was dying at her 2 Lansdowne Street, Surrey Hills address. But when he died, wore a fur coat to his funeral, as if to say, "You made your bed, now lie in it." Kate dated Walter Wally Tomlinson, also featured in the Underbelly Razor series, who she hired as a bodyguard, and was her daughter's age. This was during the late 1920s, when much of the drama with Tilly was at its height. This was a time when the razor gangs were about, and several deaths occurred, including Norman Bruins, as featured on the Underbelly Razor series. The series painted Wally in a light of adoration and loyalty to Kate. Whether he was more to her than just an employee and friend with benefits, we will never really know, but he does disappear around the early 1930s. Was it because Kate kept him at a distance and he wanted more? Or maybe he just wanted out of the violent life after some close calls with death, including the very violent Battle of Kellett Street, which goes down in history as one of the most bloody battles they had between them. That is, between the rival gangs of Razorhurst. Never short on male thugs and gangsters, Kate hired another man to stop the ever-growing gangsters standing over like Chow Hayes. And wanting a cut of her business, she hired Henry Jack Baker to be a buffer as well as a plaything. He was loyal and stood up to Chow, as mentioned in the Chow Hayes episodes we had not long ago. Chow didn't let that stop him, and he shot Jack, wounding him. This made Kate back down against Chow and his demands. Kate later used Chow to her benefit against other standover thugs. Jack and Chow worked alongside each other for her and got along quite well, despite Chow shooting Jack. Became water under the bridge, so to speak. Kate's empire grew larger and larger. She was able to purchase a 2-story terrace for herself and Eileen at 104 Riley Street in East Sydney. It was just off William Street, so it was primary real estate. She also purchased 6 other premises around Surrey Hills, rooms at the back of fruit and grocery shops and nondescript terraces where she would put her sly grog shops, serving illegal beer, wine and spirits in the forbidden hours. At this peak of Kate's career, she had more than 20 groggeries. Some of them were upmarket and frequented by businessmen. Of her upmarket grog shops, she would have businessmen come, as well as thieves and prostitutes, and she offered the ability to take grog home, kind of like our bottle-os now. She made a killing through prohibition, and with Baker and Chow, she had the thugs to keep the rivals away. However, in all of this, Kate did not like the drink. She actually wasn't into alcohol at all. Never touched the stuff, she stated, but she was happy to make the money from it. She was also in the market for stolen property, and this often was how Chow offloaded some of his stuff, as we've mentioned in his videos. But this made Kate's premises a target for raids by the police. She was known as the worst woman in Sydney, or the most evil, but to the community around her, they just adored her. It wasn't just the community. There were often a few of the police that liked her as well. Maybe not the heads of police, but the guys that walked the beat often liked Kate after there was an altercation with a young police officer who was on his own on the streets, not far from where Kate had her business. The policeman was set upon by a bunch of hoodlums, kicking him and punching him in the middle of the street. Kate caught wind of this and came out with a rifle and swore that she would shoot every last hoodlum if they didn't let the policeman go. After this, she gained a lot of respect within the police force. As I said, not the heads of police who wanted her behind bars and causing them grief, but the guys who were just earning minimum wage, walking around with their lives at stake. They were the ones who would probably turn a blind eye if they saw Kate or one of her mob doing something dodgy, unless it was really bad. Not all the police liked Kate though, and that was shown in Ray Blissett. Chow had a respect for Ray Blissett, but Ray wasn't going to take any shit. He was like the heavy of the cops. And there was one altercation that he had with Kate's daughter Eileen. When she was old enough, she started in the business as well, flogging things from various shops. One day she was done for stealing a fur coat, and when she was arrested and was being taken away, she threw herself down on the ground and screamed that Ray had beaten her or was assaulting her. Ray grabbed her by the hair and dragged her across the street on a bottom. He wasn't going to shy away like some of the other cops. Ray was nicknamed the Blizzard and had quite the reputation among the Underbelly world. Better not to mess with him if you can help it. One of the low points for Kate was when she was fined for cocaine. Her driver had basically given her away after he'd stolen a car and been arrested by the owner of it a few miles down the road. He was under the influence of alcohol and drugs and confessed to police that was how Kate paid him. She couldn't get off the drug charge that they found 8 tins of drugs being cocaine in her fireplace and vases and things like that around her home. So she was taken and arrested and given 12 months. But one of the constables got up and clapped. He'd known her for 15 years and had been trying to put her away, and at this point he'd finally won, in his opinion. And he was mouthing off as Kate was being arrested, stating that he met her daughter when she was only 15, and now her daughter was the lowest kind of woman there is. Kate was infuriated, screaming at him across the courtroom, "How dare you?" and stating that she was a good mother. He knew nothing about her. After the outburst, Kate was put behind bars. An informant had gone to police stating that Kate had organised a hitman from Melbourne to take out the constable who'd spat all that stuff about her in the courtroom. And when she was put behind bars, the level of respect she was given amongst the other prisoners as well as the wardens, she was living just as well inside of the prison than she'd been outside of. She was even given a kitchen job, and she made all the wardens and other inmates happy with her cooking. Once out of jail, Kate was back to her old ways, getting back into the thick of things after her people were looking after the business for her while she was in jail. She wasn't one to hold back. Many liked her, but some came up against her, even in her own place of business. There was a Joe McNamara who gave a lip, and when she took out a rifle and threatened him to leave before she shot him, he called her bluff and she shot him in the groin. He survived, of course, but was tight-lipped about who did it to him, probably in fear that she'd finish him off if he said anything. For years, Kate enjoyed the high life, riling up Tilly. Their tit-for-tat went on for decades. But funnily enough, nobody liked Tilly as much as they liked Kate. Another great Kate story came from an unlikely source, Lillian Armfield, who was the first female detective or policewoman in Sydney, and probably the first in Australia, I believe. And she was getting on pretty well with Kate Leigh, as most of the police force was. There was one instance where a newer policewoman was put on the beat. Her name was Baker, and she had gotten into an altercation with Tilly, where Tilly decided to grab hold of Baker and start shaking her. Well, a tram came out of nowhere, and from that tram, a Kate Leigh dives off it and onto Tilly, putting her onto the pavement and proceeding to sit on her, while the policewoman Baker was able to make an arrest. Where did Kate come from? Nobody knows, but she was there in the nick of time for the poor policewoman. But of course, Kate wasn't all good either, and that shows when she shot Snowy Pendergrast in 1930 for trying to break into her home. She got away with it though, because he was trying to break into her home. Maggie Baker had spoken to the newspapers and said that Kate had a heart of gold. She was bad, but she was also good too. She was the kind of person that helped kids in the street if they looked lost, and even allowed homeless men to sleep in her places of business. The same police officer even stating to Kate when she was stepping over the sleeping bodies in one of her sly groggeries, "What would I do if I stepped on one of them?" And Kate simply replied, "They won't feel a thing." She was definitely larger than life. At one point, the police, who Tilly had stated were friends of Kate's, decided that they had to tip the scales. It may have looked that they were favouring Kate, so they took her in and ended up fining her for whatever they could at the time. As a result, instead of doing time in Long Bay Jail, they suggested that for a year she stayed outside of the Sydney area. Her daughter Eileen had already been sent away the previous year for prostitution and was residing in Dubbo, so that's where Kate went to, back to her hometown. It didn't last long, as she was spotted only a couple of months later back in Sydney and was arrested. The judge who had allowed her to stay away for a year in Dubbo was quite angry with her, but he sentenced her to 2 years in Long Bay Jail. But Kate wasn't that fussed. She was just happy to be back in Sydney and came down and gave them all a big hug. She was quite a funny woman. Kate even saying to one of the wardens at Long Bay, they couldn't keep me out of Sydney, and it's better than being in that blasted bush. It was funny because at the time, Tilly was also doing time in Long Bay, but not much is said about the time that both of them spent time together in prison. They most likely stayed away from each other, as there were no deaths recorded at this time. By the late 30s, Kate was now in her 50s and starting to slow down a little bit, compared to Tilly, who was 19 years younger and causing a lot of grief around Sydney. In 1936, William Mackay became police commissioner. He'd had his fair share of both of the women for many years and decided, after all of the razor slashing, gun shooting and deaths, that he wanted to bring a truce between Kate and Tilly, and it seemed to work. He brought the women into his office and stated that if they kept out of each other's business, then they wouldn't be raided so much and made an example of by the police. But they had to inform on others, as there was now a younger, more evil lot of criminals coming up through the ranks. And Kate and Tilly were one of the lesser for Mackay. But the feud between them had to settle down, as there was still quite a lot of slashings, stabbings and killings going on between them over the years. They pretty much stuck to this. Even when they ran into each other and mouthed off, it was more theatrical and more so for the community rather than the actual beef they had. Kate just wanted to live comfortably. She didn't want this terror to be going on any longer, and she'd lost a lot of good men over the years. Things were starting to settle down a little bit more for them as well, in way of their earnings. Police started attacking the vessels bringing cocaine into the harbours, and a crackdown team, or SP squad, was set out for the illegal betting in many of their sly grog houses and also in some houses of these gangsters. This cut funds to Tilly and Kate quite a lot. Many new laws as well came into effect, which also stopped much of the racketeering going on. Many of the young policemen would often break into the world if their quota was low by going and arresting Kate in her older years. They knew she wasn't going to kick up a fuss these days like possibly Tilly would, and she was always in a good mood. She'd often chat to the fellas, and after they arrested her, she would pay a fine and then get back to her own business. But they enjoyed the dealing with her because they could get their quota up and she had the money to pay them off. Well, at this point anyway. Kate's ending was quite sad. Not as sad as Tilly's, but we'll get to that in her episode. But for Kate, and Tilly, they evaded taxes and in the end had most of their property sold off to pay back the taxes for decades they hadn't paid. Now, for Kate, she ended up having a heart attack on January 31st. She died on February 4th. So many people attended her funeral. And we'll get to Tilly's funeral in her episode. But Tilly actually attended as well. And that policewoman Baker gave a lovely eulogy, stating that she wasn't all bad, that she was quite a nice old lady, especially in her older years when she was quite mellowed out. Even Tilly made a comment at the funeral, God rest the old bitch's soul. So she was liked, even by her enemies, it seems. There are so many stories we could say about Kate Leigh, more than what one episode would be able to hold. And we got quite carried away with Chow. We didn't really want that to happen again. So we tried to fit as much as we could in one episode for Kate Leigh, and no doubt in the Tilly episode and many others we'll have different entries of Kate Leigh in there as well with different stories. But what a woman. And I wouldn't say that she was the worst woman in Sydney. There've been plenty of others. But she was definitely a smart woman, made a life for herself, one that rivals any of the crooks that are around today. She definitely did it her way. You can't help but admire the woman, as the police did at the time too. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode on Kate Leigh. I'm sure we'll be in the city and finding other ways to talk about her, because she's just someone that, well, deserves a bit of a good rap, I reckon. Not because she was a crook, of course, but she's just such a lovable person. A bit of a Sydney's Robin Hood, you could say. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and comment who you liked in the Razor series the most. And we'll be doing Tilly Devine very soon.
You wanted to see me? You got 60 seconds.